Folkestone Fragments, Echoes of Art, Memory and Time Travel by the Sea. Written and read by Emre Aracı. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I take you on our stroll through fashionable Folkestone's past today, in the pages of my book, Folkestone Fragments, let me begin with a sentence that has been quietly steering this book from the very beginning. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its highest. Live in fragments no longer. As some of you may recognize, it comes from Howards End, which has long been one of my favorite novels, and E.M. Forster, one of my favorite writers. His way of charting the secret life of places has always resonated deeply. Forster himself, as we know, passed through our town on many occasions, a traveller merely in transit. Yet those brief passages left their light, unmistakable traces upon his fiction. Was it not from Charing Cross Station that Lilia was seen off, bound for Folkestone, to board the boat that would carry her across the Channel, and on towards Italy, in Where Angels Fear to Tread? And in his posthumously published Morris, did not Clive Durham dispatch a wire from Folkestone to Morris Hall's office, declaring his expectation of being met at Charing Cross upon his return from Greece? So not only Forster, but his protagonists also passed through our shores. Only connect. Yes, these words stayed with me, because Folkestone Fragments is in its essence a book about connections. Not grand, thunderous connections, but those fine, glimmering filaments that run between a place and its memory, between a town and the travellers who pass through it, between our own lives and the stories that came before us. It is also a book about fragments, literary fragments, musical fragments, architectural fragments, fragments of the past that still shimmer in the air here, and about how, by bringing them into dialogue with one another, we can begin to see the wholeness that lies beneath. And I should say at once that Folkestone Fragments is a shamelessly romantic book. It makes no attempt to follow modern literary fashions or the brisk, restless spirit of the age. Instead, it moves at the older, slower rhythm to which I have always been drawn, a rhythm in which memory has time to breathe, the past is allowed to speak, and sentiment is treated not as a fault, but as a way of perceiving the world more truthfully. It is also unavoidably a very personal book. Over more than 2 decades in Folkestone, I have formed my own quiet, intricate bonds with this town and its stories, and many of the fragments I gather here are filtered through those personal connections. In writing it, I found myself not only tracing the lives of visitors long gone, but also reflecting on the pathways of my own life that have led me here. It was a stormy evening at Folkestone's Warren camp, the white cliffs looming like ancient guardians behind us, when we pitched our tent in August 1977 with my late father, my mother and brother. And although nearly 50 years have passed, that night remains vividly etched in my mind. As pyrotechnics burst across the sky, the tent glowed with trembling light and shadow, while the rhythmic murmur of trains along the Warren threaded itself into my imagination, a low iron lullaby from some unseen horizon. We had travelled far to reach that little patch of Kentish earth. My parents and I had driven all the way from Istanbul in our Opel Record coupe to collect my brother, 8 years my senior, who had spent the summer improving his English at the School of English Studies in Grimston Gardens, where I too would study a few years later. It was the year of the late Queen's Silver Jubilee, bright with bunting, yet I was an 8-year-old boy who spoke not a word of English, nor had the faintest inkling of Forster or the secret correspondences between prose and passion. From Folkestone we drove all the way to Edinburgh via London, and I found myself unexpectedly charmed by the Athens of the North, its romantic castle, stone terraces and volcanic crags, leaving an imprint far deeper than I could have articulated at that age. And I often think of that summer of 1977 when I walk by the sea on the Leas, and how strangely prophetic it all was, for I would one day read music at Edinburgh University's Historic Faculty of Music and eventually settle in Folkestone's Grand Hotel. The Grand, with its faded Edwardian splendour, seemed to open the door to a parallel life, a quiet kind of time-travelling shaped by the elegance I had glimpsed in Forster's worlds and the lush merchant ivory adaptations. In its corridors and sea-facing rooms, I recognized the atmosphere I had always sought, a life touched by beauty, memory, and that older music of the past. After all, this was the town where a time traveller, albeit one bound for the future, had settled more than a century ago, just along the coast in Sandgate. In The Time Machine, H.G. Wells imagined a civilization grown comfortable yet diminished, its curiosity waning, its spirit dulled, and its fear of the dark quietly gathering momentum. But what a waste, I have often thought, to use such a magical vehicle, a glorified bicycle, merely to plunge ahead into the future, just as Evelyn Waugh felt before me. On rereading Wells's dystopian novel, he remarked that he found that destination dreary enough, and that were he to ride that contraption, he would simply set the engine slow astern. And so, in Folkestone Fragments, that is precisely what I choose to do. Following that backward drift through time would even lead me, in the pages of my book, to encounter Waugh himself in Folkestone on more than one occasion, first in the summer of 1930, and later during his stay in the very building where I began writing, the Grand, in August 1955, exactly 70 years ago. In that earlier visit of 1930, long before Brideshead Revisited had been imagined, the 27-year-old Waugh swept into town with his Oxford Circle aboard a specially reserved Pullman carriage, part of the exuberant escapades of the Oxford University Railway Club. That gleeful young company, still steeped in what he would later describe as Oxford in those days, a city of aquatint, her autumnal mists, her grey springtime, the soft vapours of 1,000 years of learning, a cloistral hush which gave our laughter its resonance. It was precisely that world, with its chestnuts in flower and bells ringing over gables and cupolas, that seemed to spill into their Folkestone adventure. It was a world of elegance and high spirits, Waugh fresh from dining with Edith Sitwell and assorted grandees, his companions Brian Guinness, Harold Acton, and Viscount Weymouth, resplendent with youthful bravado. Guinness at that time was married to Dinah Mitford of the celebrated Sisters, to whom Waugh would dedicate Vile Bodies. A bemused Folkestone hotelier, misunderstanding the nature of their gathering, had even prepared an enormous ballroom for their arrival. They did not linger long. choosing instead to dash off to Brighton in Brian Guinness's motorcars. But the scene remains one of those irresistible fragments of the interwar world that shimmer through this story. 25 years later, war returned to Folkestone, this time to a world irreversibly altered by the Second World War, and he himself now a celebrated author. Brideshead Revisited lay behind him, shaped in part by the very calamities that war had wrought. In August 1955, he sought temporary refuge at the Grand, intending, as he noted in his diary, to begin the account of my late lunacy, a wry reference to the hallucinations he had suffered during his 1954 voyage to Ceylon. The strange experiences that would later flower into the ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold. Lady Diana Cooper drove him down, and his initial impressions were gently sardonic. The Edwardian brickwork pleased him. The staff were civil and obliging. Yet the cooking and the clientele left much to be desired. His stay unfolded with the sort of quiet absurdities that so often animate his fiction. He was first shown into a spacious suite with a piano, then abruptly moved elsewhere. The next morning he was jolted awake by workmen hammering all around him, and under grey skies he set out in search of the Catholic church in the town. In a letter to Nancy Mitford, he later confessed with relish that he had taken to sending stern culinary notes to the chef. "Don't put cornflour in the sauce," prompting the man to glower at him from behind a screen in the dining room. Yet little did I know, when I had moved into the Grand as an avid lover of Brideshead Revisited, that the building itself carried the faintest thread of connection to war. Brief, certainly, but unmistakably there. Brideshead Revisited does indeed naturally speak to all who cherish nostalgia and the ache of lost youth, not least through its legendary Granada adaptation. In my own search for its soul, I wandered to Castle Howard, that television-born vision of Marchmain grandeur, and to Madresfield Court near Morven, the true inspiration for the book, home of the Ligon family, and then on to Oxford in pursuit of further unforgettable echoes. Yet there was one echo I was astonished to discover, a fleeting glimpse of Istanbul, the city of my childhood and early youth, in the 6th chapter, where Lord Sebastian is found at the bar of the Hotel Tokatlian on the old Grande Rue de Pera, having slipped the ever-watchful Mr. Samgrass. Moore himself had lunched there in May 1929, writing to Henry York on the hotel's own stationery while on the Mediterranean cruise that became his first travel book, Labels. The Hotel Tokatlian was a name I knew well. My maternal grandmother and her family had frequented it in its early 20th century heyday. That same famed establishment where Agatha Christie lodged her Hercule Poirot at the opening of Murder on the Orient Express. The Hotel Tokatlian, alas, has long since vanished, although its facade survives, standing now as a quiet remnant, preserved in memory and in literature. Among my grandmother's keepsakes were 2 teaspoons engraved Tokatlian, a tiny, gleaming link to that lost world, now resting with me at the Grand, perhaps even in the very room where war once stayed, their story now quietly immortalized in Folkestone Fragments. Encounters like this remind me how porous the boundaries of place and memory can be. Cities we leave behind continue to echo in the most unlikely corners of our lives. Lost worlds persist in the texture of our imaginations, and long walks summon still more unexpected connections. I often wander from the Grand down to Folkestone Harbour, through the lower Leas coastal park, now stripped of its cross-channel bustle. The old railway platforms, once alive with steam, porters, trunks, and the clamour of departures, stand beautifully restored, yet eerily empty, their purpose erased, their throng long vanished. So many travellers must have streamed through this stretch of coast. Diplomats, aristocrats, artists, soldiers, émigrés. The whole world, one might say, on its way to or from the continent. And yet their presence lingers, only faintly, forgotten, overlooked, unrecorded, like footprints gradually claimed by the tide. Often I see faces like ghosts lingering by the quayside, and on that particular afternoon it was Oscar Wilde who stepped out of the mist, holding a bunch of lilies, waiting to cast them at the feet of Sarah Bernhardt. It was May 1879, and the great French tragedian, travelling with the revered Comédie Française, was en route to London for her inaugural British tour. One can almost hear the shouts of "Vive Sarah Bernhardt!" and imagine the commotion Folkestone Harbour must have witnessed that day. She would pass through the town many more times, and would even appear on the stage of its long-lost Pleasure Garden Theatre, captivating audiences with her Margaret Gautier in La Dame aux Camélias by Dumas Fils. The historic resonance of this event was duly acknowledged by the Folkestone Herald, which declared on that momentous occasion, "In things theatrical, Saturday last was the biggest day in the history of Folkestone." And the paper was right. One need only think of Alphonse Mucha's much-admired posters of her in this role, now adorning almost every corner of Prague, gazing out at us from souvenir shops with that unmistakable, otherworldly poise. Yet I often think of her when I glance across from my flat into the empty restaurant of the Metropole, and imagine her ghostly silhouette shimmering there, especially on those evenings when the Kent Fire Brigade arrives at the Grand for yet another false alarm, and their blue lights flicker across the windows of that deserted room. For it was at the Metropole in 1905 that Sarah Bernhardt lodged. Little trace of that visit survives today, scarcely a whisper in living memory, let alone a marker to say she once passed this way. And poor Oscar, with his lilies fresh from his Magdalen rooms, newly graduated from Oxford the year before, would also see his share of rising and falling fortunes in the town. When the importance of being earnest opened at Folkestone's Pleasure Gardens Theatre 9 months after its London debut in November 1895, it was greeted with great delight. And in 1910, George Alexander, who had created the role of Algernon Moncrief in the original production, paid the town a flying visit to appear in a special matinee, this time playing Jack Worthing. Yet, mere months after the premiere of Ernest, following his downfall and imprisonment, Wilde would make plans to leave for the continent via Folkestone Harbour. Breakfast at Twyford, luncheon at Richmond with Frank Harris, dinner at Folkestone, supper at Boulogne, he wrote to Mulready from prison in May 1897, although in the end it was the Newhaven-Dieppe route that carried him into exile and towards his lonely death in Paris, only a few years later. And in 1914, it was Bosie himself, Lord Alfred Douglas, who passed through Folkestone Harbour on his way back from the continent, only to be arrested on charges of libelling Robert Ross. The Folkestone Express, never one to resist a flourish, announced the news with unabashed relish on the 5th of September 1914. Lord arrested at Folkestone. At the Old Bailey, Douglas pleaded not guilty, but was committed for trial. Yet, having expressed regret for his actions and promising not to repeat the libels, he was soon released. What a curious thread of coincidence it all seemed, for not long after reading of Lord Alfred Douglas's brief entanglement with Folkestone, I found myself holding an original signed copy of his sonnets, unearthed in a second-hand bookshop in Eastbourne. Inside the book was a dedication in Bosie's own hand, dated April 1911, accompanied by a line from Blake's Auguries of Innocence. His memory had slipped a little, pain for woe, silver for silken, yet the stanza still rang with the clarity of lived truth, especially when written by that particular hand on that particular day, and in a way it epitomized Wilde's life. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. I was later to discover that Bosie's nephew, Francis Douglas, the 11th Marquess of Queensberry, and grandson of the 9th Marquess who brought down Wilde, had an intriguing Folkestone connection. For he and the Marchioness made the Grand their permanent address in 1954. His time there, however, was sorrowfully short. Gravely ill after a chest operation in London that January, the Marquess took up residence only to pass away in April, aged 58. In 1949, he had published with Percy Colson a volume drawn from the family papers that touched on his uncle Bosie's relationship with Oscar Wilde. You are one of those, alas, too few, who are always followed by the flutes of the pagan world. I shall be in town soon, and must come and charm the Sphinx with honey cakes. The trouble is, I left my flute in a railway carriage, and the fauns take so long to cut new reeds. Wilde wrote those lines to Ada Leveson when their friendship was at its most effervescent, the two of them moving through society like a private comedy of manners heard only by a few. She was his Sphinx, his loyal confidant with the quicksilver wit to match his own, and he repaid her devotion with letters that seemed to spill from some playful Arcadia within him. In her drawing-room he found a refuge from the drearier corridors of London life, a place where the flutes of his imagined fauns could still be heard above the city's clatter. Through triumphs and through the shadows that gathered later, Leveson remained one of the rare companions who understood both the sparkle and the sorrow woven through his nature, and who never let the music falter. Ada was a member of the Beddington family, that highly cultivated London household at 21 Hyde Park Square, whose paths they often led with a certain effortless grace to Folkestone and the Grand during their holidays. Ada's father, forever anxious about his own health and that of others, was often likened to Mr. Woodhouse in Jane Austen's Emma. Her sisters, Sybil and Violet, were no less luminously placed. Sybil served as the opera composer Puccini's muse and corresponded with him from the Grand, Violet, on the other hand, married the writer Sidney Schiff and presided over the legendary 1922 dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris that brought Marcel Proust and James Joyce together. All three sisters were very musical, having taken lessons with Sir Paolo Tosti, that legendary singing master, whose charming salon pieces floated through Edwardian drawing rooms and many of Folkestone's elegant gatherings. Violet, endowed with a captivating voice, was even accompanied by Tosti himself on the pianoforte at a charitable concert at the Grand in Folkestone in September 1904. These impressions, vivid and affectionate, later resurfaced in Ada's 1916 novel Love at Second Sight, where she recast Tosti as Sir Tito Landi. With his white moustache, pink and white complexion, and large bright blue eyes, his dandified dress, his eyeglass and buttonhole, he had the fresh fair look of an Englishman, the dry brilliance of a Parisian, the naivete of a genius, the manners of a courtier, and behind it all, the diabolic humour of the Neapolitan. Tosti himself often descended to Folkestone for lengthy sojourns at the Grand, and the great tenor Enrico Caruso, too, praised the town's invigorating sea air. In May 1906, Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly opened at Covent Garden with Caruso in the leading role, and after the performance, the composer slipped out of London and made for the continent by way of Folkestone. As he boarded the Boulogne steamer at Folkestone harbour, thoughts of Sybil pressed upon him with unwelcome force. In a letter from Milan he later confessed, "How I hated having to leave you, when the moment came for getting on to the boat at Folkestone. It made me absolutely miserable to think of all I was going to miss. Your charming and delightful company, and all your friends and your dear sister. I felt as though my heart were being torn asunder." On my long walks to Folkestone harbour, I sometimes sense Puccini's ghost lingering there as well, as if still reluctant to embark, the brim of his soft felt hat tilted against the wind, the familiar cape drawn close about him, and the glint of that impeccably groomed moustache catching the salty air for a final wistful moment. Folkestone is now rebranding itself as a music town, and I'm astonished as to how little some of the greatest musicians who have passed through here are known or acknowledged. In 1848, Chopin made his farewell to England through this very town. Only a few weeks earlier, on the 16th of November, he had given what would be his final public concert in London, a charity event for Polish refugees at the Guildhall. He was desperately unwell by then. Friends spoke of his ghostly pallor, his skeletal hands drifting over the keys with the fragile luminosity of a dying flame. Yet those who heard him that evening recalled an extraordinary poignancy in his playing, as though the music itself knew it was bidding farewell. By late November his health had collapsed entirely, and he longed to escape the damp London winter. On Thursday, 23rd of November, Chopin left the city, accompanied by his loyal friend Leonard Niedvitsky, who recorded every detail of their anxious journey. As their southeastern railway train jolted forward, Chopin suffered a terrifying seizure. His friend later confessed that he feared Chopin would die before they ever reached the coast. But the crisis passed, and by late afternoon they arrived in Folkestone, exhausted, shaken, and chilled to the bone. They took a simple meal of soup, roast beef and wine at a harbour-side inn, a modest, unceremonious supper for one of the greatest poets of the piano, perhaps at the Pavilion Hotel, opened by the railway company in 1843 for its travellers, and long since vanished, demolished, and supplanted by a modern, ugly building bereft of its former grace. From there, wrapped in furs against the Channel wind, Chopin was guided aboard the Folkestone Boulogne steamer. One imagines him pausing for a moment on the gangway, the town behind him blurred by mist. It was the last time he would ever set foot on English soil. By the evening he was in France. By the autumn of 1849 he was gone, dying in his Paris apartment, surrounded by friends, candles, and whispers of Mozart's Requiem. No plaque marks that fleeting crossing. No commemorative stone speaks his name at the harbour. And yet, for a brief, shivering moment in November 1848, the world's most exquisite musical poet passed through Folkestone as through a narrow doorway between life and death, art and silence, England and eternity. And it is here, perhaps, that another fragment in Folkestone's musical tapestry begins to shimmer. For scarcely a generation after Chopin's frail silhouette vanished into the Channel mist, another figure of towering musical stature would stand before a Folkestone audience and pay tribute to that very legacy. In July 1889, the town welcomed Hans von Bülow, one of the most formidable musicians of the 19th century, for a piano recital at the town hall. The program he offered was a glittering constellation: Bach's architectural clarity, Beethoven's granite magnificence, Schumann's romantic introspection, and Chopin. Always Chopin. Von Bülow was no mere virtuoso. He was one of the greatest musical minds of his century, Franz Liszt's son-in-law, Wagner's earliest and most loyal champion, the pioneering conductor who had premiered Tristan und Isolde and Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. He was the mentor and friend of Brahms, and later of Richard Strauss, who dedicated works to him in gratitude for his fierce advocacy. This is where one begins to see just how extraordinary the musical standards of late Victorian Folkestone truly were. In the summer of 1892, if you were living in Folkestone and found yourself in need of a piano teacher, you could study not with some provincial amateur, but with a pupil of Clara Schumann herself. A certain German lady, Fräulein Heidecker of 18 Westbourne Gardens, placed regular advertisements in the Herald in that year, offering piano lessons and proudly identifying herself as the pupil of the great Clara. It is remarkable when one considers the lineage that even Alfred Cortot, that highest priest of poetic pianism, carried within his playing an inheritance that traced back through his teacher Louis Dieme to the artistic world of Clara Schumann. Her influence, like an underground spring, fed the great river of 19th century piano playing long after her death. And I was reminded of this only recently when I found myself standing in Clara and Robert Schumann's apartment in Leipzig, and later walking to her beloved linden tree near Maxen, outside Dresden, where the landscape still seems to breathe with the quiet, steadfast lyricism of her music. How fitting, then, that Folkestone itself should have been one of the places where that lineage briefly surfaced. For Alfred Cortot, custodian of both the Schumann tradition and the Chopin inheritance, appeared in our town more than once. On Thursday, the 16th of March, 1933, as the Folkestone Herald reported, the distinguished French pianist gave a brilliant recital at the Lys Hall before a large audience, 2/3 of his program devoted to the music of Chopin. The newspaper thoughtfully reminded its readers that Courtauld had also studied with Émile Decombe, one of the last surviving pupils of Chopin himself. Among my collection there is a photograph of Alfred Courtauld, which I have reproduced in the book. He is surrounded by a small company of musicians, taken in the afterglow of one of his concerts. One's attention is caught at once by their attire, the dignified formality, the calm assurance, the quiet ceremonial air that belong to another age. And this scene, for all its elegance, is not Folkestone. It is Istanbul, in the year 1938. A few years after his appearance at the Lys Hall, Courtauld travelled to my native city for a grand concert, and the photograph preserves that moment, a distinguished gathering drawn close around the great pianist. The print bears a dedication in Courtaulds' own hand to the lady standing towards the end of the right-hand row, Mademoiselle Rana Sadri, who, in one of those delicate correspondences that life occasionally permits itself, became my brother's and my own piano teacher many years later. And the photograph was taken at the Hotel Tokatlian in Istanbul, where Lord Sebastian was once seen at the bar. And so gentle circle closes, the lineage that flows from Clara Schumann to Courtauld, from Courtauld to Istanbul, and from Istanbul back to Folkestone in the chapters of this book. In its own unobtrusive way, Folkestone Fragments comes full circle. Play me something. Play me a nocturne, Dorian, and as you play, tell me in a low voice how you have kept your youth. You must have some secret. How lovely that thing you're playing is. I wonder, did Chopin write it at Majorca, with the sea weeping round the villa and the salt spray dashing against the panes? It's marvellously romantic. What a blessing it is that there is one art left to us that is not imitative. Don't stop. I want music tonight. It seems to me that you are the young Apollo, and that I am Marsyas listening to you. I have sorrows, Dorian, of my own, that even you know nothing of. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. If the past has taught me anything, it is that these fragments do not lie scattered merely for our sentimental pleasure. They ask to be gathered, to be connected, those subtle strands of connection, as Forster might have called them, that bind place to memory, people to one another, prose to passion, and the present to the long echoes that preceded.